Although I'm Puerto Rican, I've lived in Brooklyn, New York City my entire life. However, as a child I spent many summers at my grandmother's house in Yauco, Puerto Rico. She owned vast swathes of land deep in the mountains, so deep that tracks would branch off into the remote wilderness through tapering mountain passes and where cliff edges would be mere inches from the car's tyres while travelling in pitch-black conditions. If a car were to come from the other direction, either you or they would have to drive backwards until a spot was found to allow the other to pass. Having to do so was always unnerving. The property had been passed down through my family for many generations, and we have been living in Yauco for as long as anyone can remember. As a child, I spent much of my time with my great-grandfather Pepito, who worked the land and tended to cows. He was quite elderly, and his heritage was almost entirely of native Taino Puerto Rican descent. He would tell stories of the indigenous people who resided there in the wilderness during his youth, and who, even after centuries of Spanish rule, had never culturally integrated into colonial society. My family would often protect and shelter those that the Spanish considered to be culturally wild Puerto Ricans, that is, the cultural natives of the area. And if the local Spanish officials did discover them, then los matan, they would be killed. I was first confronted with death there at around the age of 6. I would find the salamander eggs in the underbrush, which were about the size of jelly beans, and crush them, then watch the pink, undeveloped hatchlings instinctively sprint for cover. My grandmother scolded me for it, and I immediately understood what I'd done was cruel and wrong. I was overwhelmed with a sense of remorse and couldn't help but to cry. My great-grandfather described to me the strange flying discs he would often observe descending over the mountains and plunging down into the lake. He cautioned me about the phantoms in the valley, that one could listen in on them and to be vigilant when travelling the mountain roads at night from his house to my grandmother's. He instructed me on how to temper a bull with his horns and allow it to feel comfortable enough for me to ride it. He made a special whistling sound only he could produce when he wanted to garner the attention of a particular animal on the mountain, urging them to either follow him or to calm them down. He would often tell me the famous legend of Diego Salcedo, which had occurred in Yauco in the 16th century and inspired a revolution of the native Taino people. As Pepito's health declined and he neared the end of his life, our whole family came to spend time with him. For so many people in Yauco, he was a link to an era long gone. He was widely known in the community, and with the end of his life near, many of its people came to visit him at his home. I wasn't old enough to be present during his passing, nor was I mature enough to comprehend it when it occurred. I had been sent to wait at grandmother's house until the ceremonies had finished. The sun was setting. A shadow-like quality to the mountains began to loom around me. While walking on my own, I started to hear the sound of wailing coming from every direction, as if all around me all of the animals were suddenly crying out. Wild dogs howled all around the mountain. A ruckus was being made by the chickens. The pigs in the valley below were letting out blood-curdling screams, which almost sounded human, and the cows were bellowing in distraught cries. I had never heard such a cacophony of cries, seeming to come from every non-human creature in the mountain within hearing distance, and nor have I since. As a young child, you can imagine how terrifying that would have been, especially being on my own. I hid myself in the house and peered out of the window, waiting for my grandmother to come, listening to the cries of the animals. I was especially attuned to sound then, as during that time I was frequently sick and regularly on a prescription of amoxicillin, a medication to which I had an allergy. The sound was so overwhelming it felt like some kind of extrasensory experience. Eventually the animals fell silent, to which I was thankful. I questioned my grandmother before bed as to why the animals had been making such a noise. She told me about Pepito's passing, that the weight of his loss had been felt throughout the whole mountain, that all of its creatures knew of the great power he held and how he protected the land. She said now that he was gone, there was a great emptiness, and that it would be sensible to imagine that seeing his spirit cross over would have a profound impact on them. My grandmother believed that animals have an innate understanding of these things. I was unable to fall asleep. I ventured outside into the dead of night, consumed by curiosity, but also pretty terrified. I contemplated the spirits that might lurk in the pitch blackness of the mountain wilderness. I pondered the dreadful, plaintive cries of the animals and how much like those of a human that they resembled. I crept close to the edge of a small nearby cliffside that hung over what seemed like an abyss of darkness and crouched, listening. I was startled by a feral scream coming from the direction of the abyss. I wasn't sure if it was a dog, but it was definitely too close for comfort, and I was alone. It began to howl and yelp, and I immediately regretted the decision to come outside. I was petrified, just sitting there, unsure whether to move or to stay. I dared not cry out for my grandmother, as I knew a stern scolding would have been guaranteed for coming out and roaming outside in the middle of the night. Also, I would have unlikely been audible to her at such a distance anyway. A brief moment later, I heard the same whistling sound that Pepito used to make, and that only he could ever make. Out from the blackness, the howling suddenly stops. Being the age I was, it never occurred to me that it couldn't be my Pepito, even though he was no longer alive, even though it is, of course, something that would immediately occur to any reasonable adult. It's Pepito, I thought to myself. It has to be. Nobody else can whistle like that. No one in my family knew how to whistle like that, and we were the only ones for miles around on the mountain. It would be impossible for any person to be in the position where the sound came from. Even in the daytime, it would not be possible, let alone in the pitch blackness of the night. It was in the depths of the wilderness, atop a steep cliffside. But there was no doubt in my mind that he was up there. I often wonder if the lines between life and death are less stable and clear at such a young age. Yauco is known to be the area in which Agabana I, who was chief to the people of Taino in the 16th century, lived. This is also where Diego Salcedo, the conquistador, met his end by drowning, and where the rebellion against the Spanish began. The Taino who survived hid in the mountains of Yauco for a long time, living their lifestyle in secret behind some of the more integrated natives, such as Pepito. It is said that the Taino are extinct, but that cannot be true. I was familiar with many of them. In fact, I consider myself to be one of them, if only just a little.